The next stop is Avenue J.
Tonight's lecture is one that has some personal connection to me, because I'm going to be focusing on someone who was discovered by a close academic friend of mine. We don't know anything about him except for what my colleague, Dr. Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, discovered, and it is truly amazing what he discovered. I'd like to spend the first part of the lecture showing you a little bit about the discovery, because it itself is fascinating, and then we will delve into what we know about Hillel Bal Shem. We're speaking about someone who lived in the early 18th century and was in the same profession as the famous Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, Israel ben Eliezer, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement. And the contrast between these two figures, because they were both in the same business of sort of popularizing religion in southern Ukraine, in western Ukraine, southern Poland, offers a fantastic sort of background contrast to the rise of the Hasidic movement and some tremendous insights into that period as a whole. So let me start with the discovery of this manuscript. First of all, here's some personal photographs. Here is a photograph of myself on the right here. That's kind of amazing, right? This is 1992. And I know you're thinking, how could he possibly wear a white suit? I mean, I wouldn't even wear a white suit on Purim nowadays. You couldn't cut me. It's like I wear a loincloth rather than wearing a white suit. But it's true. Back in 1992, I did wear a white suit, and I wore a white hat too. That was walking around Kiev. I thought I was like in disguise. You know, there's a lot of Orthodox people in Florida. They walk around, they put on a baseball cap. They think no one will recognize them. Figure they won't know who they are on the beach. But at any rate, here's me when I was a young graduate student, and I was in Kiev. And this is Norman Ross. He was a microfilm publisher. Microfilm, for those of you who were born you know, it's a tiny, but what they were doing is, because the Soviet Union had just collapsed, there was a tremendous new opportunity to access lots of fantastic archives. And so Norman was there, you know, having a look at the archives and trying to determine what would be useful to photograph and then disseminate through universities. So he called me in to meet with this man here, Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, absolutely brilliant graduate student. He earned his first PhD in Spanish literature, because it was forbidden for him to study Jewish literature at the time, but he did a brilliant thesis on Borges, on the Jewish influence in Borges, fascinating material. And Norman Ross, the publisher, had said, you gotta have a look at what this young guy has discovered, and let me know what you think of it. Is it worth my while to publish it? And it was an absolutely fantastic trove. So this is what he found. It is this is only one section of it, but this is a massive trove of 17th and 18th century handwritten documents from the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Absolutely amazing, priceless material that had been preserved in the Russian archives, and then later, actually, in the libraries, and then later in the Soviet archives. There's a whole fascinating story about how these materials survived. Stalin, apparently the librarians were afraid. They didn't know which way to jump with the material, because between the period of 1918 and 1930, it was sort of in to be pro-Jewish. There was a kind of a Korenizatsiya program, which meant it was useful to look into the true origins of the Jewish population of Russia. Then after that, you had the purges, and then it was very uncool to be Jewish. And the librarians didn't know which way to jump, so they stuck all this stuff in a basement. Luckily, it survived in, atrocious kind of conditions to protect it, but nevertheless, absolutely amazing materials. Here's a picture of Yochanan, who was the researcher who was working on these materials, taught himself Hebrew, taught himself Aramaic, I actually knew him just at the very beginning of this stage. I'm proud to say I gave him his first siddur, which he continues to cherish. He's, by the way, in town. He just had an exhibition in town this Saturday night. Anyways, here he is. You can see the state of the books over there. And I'll show you a couple of examples. Most of them are pinkasim, which means they are minute books of local communities, meaning the births, deaths, marriages, important events in tiny little shtetl that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. Absolutely fascinating social history of individual towns and townlets. Very important for genealogical researchers, for social researchers, and so on. This is one page which has the Russian eagle is printed on it, and then in Hebrew there's this very flowery dedication to the Tsar, Pavel Petrovich, which was a late 18th century Tsar. Here's another one that has the symbols of the zodiac, the Hebrew zodiac, and underneath a sort of poem invoking the contents of the books. Really incredible treasures of the Jewish people located in the Vernadsky Library of Kiev. And here is Yochanan holding a book. Now, I didn't actually ask him. This actually may be the book that we're talking about today. I can't quite make out the Hebrew on the text, but it's a handwritten book. It's a manuscript, not a book per se, but it is bound in leather. The back binding is missing, and it's got a copper front, which does make sense that that's how he describes the book he's talking about in today's discussion. And it's about 760 pages long. It is the autobiography and a Kabbalistic manual of healing written by Hillel Baal Shem. That's what we're going to be talking about today. A manuscript that my colleague Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern discovered in Kiev, and what it has to say about the pre-Beshtian atmosphere of Eastern Europe. Besht, by the way, is an acronym for Baal Shem Tov, the so-called master of the good name, and that is the term used to describe the founder of the Hasidic movement. Here's just a couple other pictures. He went on, of course, by the way, to a brilliant career. He postdocs in Cornell, Oxford, Harvard, Hebrew University. And he ended up doing a second PhD under Antony Polonsky in Jewish history at Brandeis. And now he's a distinguished professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. He wrote this book among many, many others. This won the National Jewish Book Award, The Golden Age Shtetl, A New History of Jewish Life in East Europe. Absolutely fascinating. He also is an artist. This cover was painted by him, and he has an exhibition that's showing in New York, just opened up on Saturday. Here's just to show that I'm not the only one who aged. Here he is. This is what he looks like today. Also the salt and pepper beard. This obviously is, he's my contemporary. We're about the same age. And he can carry off a lot. I mean, here he is. He wears an ascot sometimes. He wears a beret. Like, the best I can do is wear a white suit. That's it. But he can, carry off these kinds of clothes. Anyways, that's Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, and we're going to be discussing his research today. Any questions, arguments, discussions? He was born in Kiev. Actually, I can tell you one short story about him. You have to realize we're talking about a person whose intelligence, I don't think he should take an IQ test because it would probably break the machines. This guy is so off the top. He had never been out of the Soviet Union, and he had memorized the London subway system. The London subway system makes the New York subway system look like, child's Lego, right? But he's memorized it. We used to play this game. I would ask him how to get from, this part of London to that part of London. He would tell me exactly the train. It's brilliant. I once lost a bet to him about how to pronounce a word in the English language. It was crazy. When I was there, they had these very restrictive visa limitations where you weren't allowed to travel 60 kilometers out of where your visa was allowed. So, and people would rat on you. People would catch you and so on. So we were doing this thing where normally he and I spoke English because his English is stronger than my other languages. But we were we left our visa zone. Well, he was allowed to travel. I wasn't, but we were speaking only Ukrainian on the platforms of the train and speaking with the clerk and that sort of thing. And then I got into a little bit of trouble at the buying my ticket. I said it to the wrong, whatever it was. Anyways, we got into the train car, and I said to him in English, "Wow, I was really worried about the conversation with that clerk." And he said, "You mean Clark?" And I said, "No, I mean clerk." He says, "No, it's pronounced Clark." And I said, "Are you telling me my own language?" And he insisted it was Clark. And he bet me a case of beer that it was in fact pronounced Clark. I know, but you see, I gotta tell you how I lost the bet. So we went off to Moscow, we did what we were doing there, we came back to his apartment in Kiev. He went into the apartment, first thing with me, he pulled off a 1907 British pronunciation dictionary, he opened it up, and there it was Clark. It turned out he had memorized the entire dictionary. I mean, who memorizes dictionaries? The scary kind of intelligent guy. Anyways, I'm very proud to know him, call him my friend. Yes, please. Yes, I do. His father was actually a dissident, and his ancestral name was Stern, which is very Jewish, but they had changed it to Petrovsky during the period of purges, which means that's a very Ukrainian kind of name, son of Petrov, as an attempt to sort of disguise the Jewish background. That's when he came to America and he's kind of rediscovering his Jewish identity and so on. He changed his name to Petrovsky-Stern. Back then he was just Ivan Petrovsky. Now he's Yochanan Petrovsky Stern. I don't know too much about his mother. I think his mother was an opera singer or something. I'll have to ask him. Shall we go on? Yes, okay. Maybe sometime we'll have him here, give a guest lecture. It'll be a lot of fun. Okay. So he discovered this book. He discovered this 760-page manuscript, which, he describes in the seminal article he wrote on this, that he was trying to figure out what exactly is this book. It's not cataloged, doesn't belong in the Firkovich collection, doesn't belong in the Harkavi collection. What exactly is this strange book? It was, kind of this rambling autobiographical discussion of an individual person's life and his experimentation with theurgic Kabbalah, meaning his casting of spells, exorcisms, all kinds of spooky stuff like that, with lots and lots of Kabbalistic diagrams and instructions for practitioners of practical Kabbalah. Very highly unusual document. There are, as we shall discuss later, some published versions of manuals of this nature that pale by comparison. And throughout the book, the author, who calls himself Hillel, he does not give his father's name, insists that all those other published manuscripts are wrong. Only these Kabbalistic drawings and incantations and spells and so on are correct, and people should stay away from those published versions for reasons that we will explore in a moment. So the document is dated 1739, and it has a lot of geographic information in it, so we know that he was active exactly in the same region that the much more famous Baal Shem Tov was active, and doing much of the same kind of thing. And one of the questions that I'd like to answer today is, how is it that the Baal Shem Tov founded an entire movement, which is, hundreds of thousands of people strong and made tremendous contributions to Jewish culture, whereas Hillel, who seems to have been a very active individual, nevertheless could not get traction and was ultimately forgotten except for this one manuscript. So he was active primarily in this region here, which would be eastern Galicia, the southern part of Poland. This map here shows contemporary Ukraine. Poland is over here, Lublin, Warsaw up higher. So this is the region where traditionally Hasidism developed. What exactly is Hasidism? We should probably pause to talk about that. And I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the general contours of 18th century Jewish history at this point. The Hasidic movement is this populist movement that grew in the early 18th century. It is associated primarily with the Baal Shem Tov, whose years are roughly 1700 to 1760. There's some debate as to the birthday. 1760 is considered fairly authentic as his date of death. So we're talking about someone who in his, let's say, 30s was beginning to spawn a movement that eventually would create tremendous shock waves throughout Eastern Europe. The characteristics of the movement emphasized an approach to God that was not rigidly text-oriented. In other words, the northern regions, Lithuania in particular, were associated with status derived through Talmudic learning. Perhaps here I should pause to remind everyone of the three ways that Jews attain status traditionally. What is the first way that Jews traditionally get status? I'm sorry, learning? Thank you, learning. Learning is actually number 3. Money is number 1. Thank you. Money always works, right? You can get status through money. It's probably the fastest way. And then there's learning is number 3. And number 2, yichus. Thank you so much. So yichus or lineage. You know, if your family background has illustrious individuals. So these are 3 basic routes to status in the Jewish world is money, yichus, or learning. Now, unless you have money or yichus, the only option to gain status is through learning, which is wonderful because it's democratic. Everyone has equal access, theoretically, to the text, at least males. Everyone has the opportunity to, demonstrate their prowess and hopefully advance. And Jewish society will support people who otherwise are impecunious and need some sort of social structure to allow them to study. So there's always a possibility of social advancement through learning. But there's a huge divide between the great yeshivas that were centered in the north, most famously in Lithuania, where the Vilna Gaon, who died in 1797, was especially active. And it's really only in the north that you have these massive centers of intellectual activity centered in deciphering the very complex, arcane language of the Talmud. In the southern regions here, you have a much more peasant-based culture, a far more illiterate population, even a Jewishly illiterate population. What does that mean, Jewishly illiterate? Jews typically were involved in several linguistic environments. They would typically converse with the surrounding population, particularly economically, in Ukrainian, sometimes Russian, sometimes Polish, whatever the dominant vernacular was. Not necessarily the state vernacular, but what people would speak in the street. But they would very rarely have much ability to write in that language. They would converse at home in Demamaloshin, Yiddish, which is a language that's basically medieval German, written in Hebrew characters for those who can read it, and with a very high degree of Hebraisms and Romance influences, Slavicisms, and so on. Billy Crystal called Yiddish basically German with phlegm, right? I like that. But anyways, so they'd speak Yiddish at home, speak something like Ukrainian, Polish in the street when they were doing business. But the holy language of Hebrew was something that was fairly closed to most Jews. Certainly the vast majority of women were unable to read and understand Hebrew. And if they did have some reading knowledge, it was typically only the ability to pronounce the words, like actually sound them out, without necessarily understanding the meaning of the text. And men were not that much better. To give a sense of what are the numbers, in the 1897 census, which is about 200 years after the period we're talking about today, there's a report of about 60% literacy among the Jews of Ukraine. I mean, 6 out of 10 Jews are literate in any language, ability to read and write in any language. So if we say that 60% is overwhelmingly men, and the literacy they have is overwhelmingly going to be in Yiddish or maybe some in the vernacular, the literacy of Hebrew is remarkably low. So even though, and by the way, that towers over the literacy levels of peasants, and even over the literacy of city dwellers. So Jews are still far more literate than the surrounding population, but we should not misunderstand the level of literacy that's present. And the literacy is going to be lowest in Ukraine as opposed to Lithuania, northern Poland, places like that. This movement that was engendered by the Baal Shem Tov emphasized, on the other hand, many other ways to approach God through devekut, or cleaving unto God, a kind of a mystica unio mystica, a mystical approach to God, a way of coming close to God through other means besides, the intellectual experience of Talmudic debate. It includes things like mashke, drinking alcohol, especially with others. There's not to be denied the value of a little bit of communal alcohol consumption with others in a Farbrengen kind of environment. Singing, especially wordless tunes called nigunim, which especially when combined with alcohol in a community with others, have a kind of a transformational kind of impact. The power of story, the power of tale, which was really developed in the Hasidic world through Rabbi Nachman and others, basically ignored by the Lithuanians as sort of foolish fiction. And dance, sometimes exuberant, enthusiastic movement in prayer, all kinds of things that emphasize the love of a simple Jew for God and the ability to attain some level of spiritual enlightenment that was divorced from the rigorous, analytical, logical approach to text that was the leitmotif of the Lithuanian population. So those are kind of the religious elements of Hasidism that brought them into great conflict with the Lithuanians, particularly at the end of the 18th century. It's a little bit ahead of our story, but to give you some sense of the contrast, there are so many examples. Let me just choose one for now. The Lithuanians, very, very particular about times of prayer. Just to choose one example, right? If I pull out my iPhone and I tell the iPhone exactly where I am, what part of the world I'm in, it will tell me exactly when I may say the first blessings in the morning, when I may don my tefillin, when I must say the Shema prayer before it's too late, all kinds of things that give me a very, very precise windows of opportunity to utter the morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. The Lithuanians pride themselves on this degree of scrupulosity. They, say this is how it's supposed to be done. These are the times. And in fact, even the controversies between the Magen Avram and the Vilna Gaon over, literally minutes in calculation are proudly presented on my iPhone, so I can decide whether I'm going to hold like the Vilna Gaon or the Magen Avram, depending on what time I wake up. That was a joke? Okay. Anyways, the Hasidim sort of threw that out the window and said, what is this business? You're going to pray. You're going to, pour your soul out to God. You're going to communicate with the supreme being, the master of the universe, and you're focused so much on the time. You can't do that. You have to get yourself into the mood. You have to become enthused. You have to be able to approach God with respect and awe and with excitement and with trepidation, all of these things. And, if you can't do it exactly on the schedule that it says on your iPhone, then it's, garnished helfen. It can't be like that. So the Hasidim tended to be much more laid back about times of prayer. Whereas the Lithuanians would say, hey, listen, if you don't say the Shema prayer by 9:14 in the morning, it's all over. The Hasidim would say, we're going to start prayers at 10:30 this week. Now, to be fair, the Hasidim are not slouches when it comes to halacha, and they would say you should say the Shema in advance at home before you come to the 10:30 prayer. And hopefully, good Hasidim do in fact conform to the halacha. But the atmosphere is much more one of like, let's come together with sort of like the right mood and the right atmosphere, and after having a good schluf and maybe a little snack and things like that. It's a very different kind of approach. And I'm not trying to demean either side. The Lithuanian approach, though, values and finds religious meaning in adherence to detail. The Hasidim tend to find meaning in the spontaneity and the gregariousness of a more relaxed approach. One way that I explained it to my son once, my son whose shoes I'm wearing right now, is, because I tend to go to both Hasidic and Mitnagdic shuls. I don't know why. I like to go to more than one shul, typically on a Shabbos. And my son once asked me, why is it such a difference between these shuls? And I said, and I think it was actually right on, the Misnagdim, the so-called opponents of Hasidim as they were eventually became known, the Misnagdim value adherence to the law. What is the law? What does God want us to do? We are going to be really good at that. And the Hasidim really value Ahavas Yisrael, love of fellow Jews. And it's not that they don't love the law or that Misnagdim don't love other Jews, but there is where do you draw the balance? Where do you draw the line? And Hasidim definitely draw the line towards Ahavas Yisrael. I'm sorry to go on too much detail. I've talked about religious and geographic elements. The economic elements is particularly useful when we discuss Hillel's career. One of the most fascinating analyses of the early Hasidic movement was written by a scholar named Ben Sion Dinor, who used, before I was born, the famous Abramson rule of history. Do you all remember what is the Abramson rule of history? You've been coming to my lectures for so many weeks, you should know this one, right? When you don't know why something happens, the answer probably is money, right? That's it. That's the Abramson rule of history. All you out there on the internet, please remember, Abramson rule of history is money. It's usually about money. So Ben Sion Dinor wrote a fascinating analysis of the economic origins of the Hasidic conflict with the Misnagdim. We must bear in mind that many of the town rabbis, particularly in the less educated region of Ukraine, were actually appointed by the lords of the non-Jewish lords of those individual towns. You could actually buy the rabbinate in a particular shtetl. You could say, hey, this is a business. I'm going to bribe the Lord, and the Lord will give me the shtela, the position of being the town rabbi, and then I can collect the various taxes that are applied to kosher meat and to candles and to all other things. And it was actually a business. There's a lot of halachic discussion talking about whether or not you can inherit a business like this. So, as you might imagine, a lot of the rabbis at the end of the 17th century, they were not necessarily the most caring, compassionate, pastoral counselors that you would expect from the rabbis of the period. And the reality is that many simple Jews were not motivated to go to their rabbis. They certainly didn't feel that they were going to offer them any spiritual uplift. They were not going to give them any inspirational ideas. And so the rabbinate was into a period of very steep decline. Along comes this Hasidic movement, to which both Hillel and the Baal Shem Tov were participants, and in which they were participants. And suddenly, instead of going to the town rabbi to these boring, services that start exactly on time, but there's no schnapps and there's no chevra, there's no friendship, there's no singing, things like that. You can go to a charismatic, non-official rabbi who just has a private prayer group in his house typically, or in a house rented by a more wealthy member of the community. And you can sit and have a glass of lamashka with the Rebbe, and you can discuss Torah concepts, and you can sing, and you can, and suddenly feel like you're part of the community. And these alternate services eventually became so strong that they were supplanting the traditional services. And when certain innovations came in place, like Hasidic slaughter of animals, for example, then people began to say, why should I go buy traditional slaughtered meat, it has to do with a big controversy over the way a knife is sharpened. Why should I go buy my meat from the traditional Lithuanian rabbi, who is a good for nothing that I don't like anyways? I'm going to go to the Hasidic Rebbe, who I happen to like a lot, who I think likes me. And you know what? I'm going to buy his shechita, the slaughtering that he does, and he'll get the benefit of it economically. And all of a sudden, this posed a grave economic threat to the status quo, which was, according to Professor Dinur, a major element in the backlash against Hasidim that came from Lithuania. Enough said for today. The last thing that we have to say about the Balei Shem is, so let's go to Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov. Can I get a translation of that term, Baal Shem Tov? Master of the good name. Well, what exactly does that mean? Why do we call him the Baal Shem Tov? Master of the good name. Aha. Shem is, of course, the name of God. A Baal Shem is someone who knows how to manipulate the name of God for various Kabbalistic purposes. And the Baal Shem Tov, does the word Tov, good, does that modify Shem, which means God, the master of the good God, or does it modify Baal, the master? Meaning this is the good Baal Shem, as opposed to the regular Balei Shem. And in fact, Dr. Petrovsky-Stern and others would argue that the Baal Shem Tov was so named because he stood in direct contrast to all the other Balei Shem, who were not nearly so Tov, who were not nearly so good, who were in fact somewhat unscrupulous. So that's what we're going to explore here. Who were these Balei Shem? What did they do? So, Hillel is a great example. This is the best example we have. Again, a 760-page manuscript. That's a massive document telling us about the life of a Baal Shem from the inside, as he sees it himself. Very much open to lots of fascinating literary criticism, which Dr. Petrovsky-Stern does so masterfully. What he describes in this book is, for example, his extensive medical training. He was not a doctor. He didn't go to any of the great universities like Padua or elsewhere in Western Europe, but he did apprentice under many Jewish doctors. And he lists his apprenticeship pedigree with great pride, talking about he worked with this doctor who stopped a plague in Rome, and he worked with this doctor and that doctor, and he learned all of this, late 17th century medicine from lots of senior doctors, Jewish doctors at the time. His Talmudic training, however, is evidently is evident by its absence. It appears that he did not have significant Talmudic training. He is called by the name rabbi, which is not necessarily a difficult term to acquire or a title to acquire in those days. But he claims no great facility with the Talmud. He studied at no yeshiva for any length of time. He does not feel that in any way impugns his status as a Baal Shem or the kinds of skills that he has to offer, and we'll discuss exactly what those things are in a moment. What he does discuss at significant length in the manuscript is, alongside his medical training, extensive Kabbalistic training with very well-known Kabbalists of the 16th and early 18th century, 17th and early 18th century in particular, talking about how he was personally apprenticed to this Kabbalist or that Kabbalist and learned all of their secrets, which he then employs in his activities. What are exactly his activities? What does he do for a living? Well, he travels from town to town, and he performs various Kabbalistic services for people. What kind of services? Almost all of them, as you can probably guess from the fact that his background is medical, almost all of them deal with various ailments. Health, there's a whole list of everything from hemorrhoids to depression to just about you name it. He is treating it. He is involved in all kinds of medical activities. And he has kind of an unusual balance of Western science and traditional Kabbalah in approaching these various ailments. He also treats all kinds of social maladies too. People who want to get a shidduch, they want to get a marriage partner, or they are having difficulty with parnasa, having difficulty making money, they'll go to people like Hillel, and they will ask him for various treatments that will deal with their social ills as well. The kinds of treatments that he dispenses are typically amulets, and in fact the term Baalei Shem is often synonymous with the term amulet maker. And he will produce these handwritten amulets, very often using, symbols like the Star of David, which is not especially old at this point, but as we discussed in the David Gans lecture, it's become tremendously popular because of its symbolism and its parallelism. Often inscribed with the names of angels, perhaps a little sprinkling of Sabbatean ideology, which we see creeping into a lot of these theurgic Kabbalists. By the way, the term theurgic Kabbalah, it's the next slide, sorry. Theurgic means practical in the sense of actually affecting something, as opposed to theoretical Kabbalah, which is like discussing the nature of the soul and the unfolding of creation and things like that. Theurgic Kabbalah is how to make things happen, how to make this person love me, how to make this person give me his business, things like that. And he's going around and creating these amulets, which are consumed widely throughout the region of Eastern Europe. And in case you're thinking this sounds so bizarre, it is not at all. I really should have done a little more work with some images, but amulets continue to be very popular even in the 21st century Jewish community. Go to any Jewish bookstore and you will easily find, like by the cash register, these little laminated things that have names of angels, maybe a few verses from Psalms that are good for childbirth or for health or for parnasa or for shidduchim. Alla gutas, all the same things that we've been looking for centuries, and we will still find people who are producing these things. Sometimes they're kind of like an identifier of Jewish status, like the chamsa with the blue colors, very much associated with avoidance of the evil eye. And I'm not sure about this, but I believe the widespread phenomenon, which was very popular in my youth, of wearing a mezuzah, wearing a little metal cylinder that has the name of God inside it, which is like just off the wall totally halachically. So many things you can't do with it. It's difficult to go into a bathroom with it, things like that. Nevertheless, it was like, if you were Jewish, you wear a mezuzah in the 1970s, right? That's what people did. That's all within the same category of these amulets that Baalei Shem were making. We're talking about something that goes back thousands of years, literally, in Jewish culture. There's a lot of discussion of it even in the Talmud and in the Mishnah, whether or not amulets work, what kinds of amulets work, and so on. So that's basically what he's doing. But he describes in particular one story that is especially instructive, where he performed an exorcism at the village of Ostra. Exorcism in Judaism, although that's a very Catholic term, nevertheless, exorcism has a hoary past in Jewish thought. There is this idea that other spirits, other consciousnesses may enter a person, either in a positive sense, which is called, if I remember correctly, an Iber Neshama or something, an extra soul, another soul that can take over a person, like the spirit of Rabbi Akiva can take over a person and so on. And then the negative one is so-called dibuk. Dibuk, which means something that sticks to a person. And there's lots of interesting Jewish anthropological stories about how dibukim are created. Let's discuss the specific one that's described in this story. So Hillel talks about how there was this one woman in the village of Ostro who was experiencing a whole host of maladies, and she had gone to many doctors, and the communal authorities were very worried about her status as well, and they only with great reluctance called upon Hillel, who was traveling through the region at the time, to please treat this woman. The fact that the communal authorities were hesitant to employ his services, I think, says a lot about the way in which these Baalei Shem may have been approached by the establishment. But nevertheless, with some persuasion, he was eventually brought in to treat the woman. He described how the diagnosis of the woman's situation was that there was a crime that was committed in the community several years prior, and a person was not properly buried as a result, and so that person became kind of a restless spirit who did not want to go on to the next world. He resided in a fruit tree, which is typically where these spirits, so to speak, live. Palm trees are a big favorite. That's why in Florida, it's a lot of crazy people there. And at any rate, this woman, the patient, fell asleep under that tree, and the Dybbuk entered through her right eye and then took over her body and gave her various manifestations of bizarre behavior. Hillel was called in, and Hillel initiates a dialogue with the Dybbuk, with the additional spirit. The Dybbuk not only goes on to, and this is the woman speaking, right? This is like the speaking in tongues kind of thing, that the Dybbuk is speaking through the woman, the patient. The Dybbuk goes on to describe not only the crime that was originally committed many years earlier that gave the Dybbuk his restless spirit and so on, but also goes on to list a whole pile of dirty laundry about all of the communal elders in town, and says, by the way, you shouldn't believe what this person did and what that person did. And it was like a whole National Enquirer Lashon Hara fest, but the Dybbuk saying all these embarrassing things about the people in town. So what ended up happening is the Dybbuk would not leave, and Hillel was unsuccessful in removing the exorcism. He blamed it, and actually the Dybbuk, he reports, blames it as well on the refusal of the town council to own up to their prior sins. But despite this failure, he was nevertheless evicted from the community. He had to continue his wanderings to other communal locations as well. You can imagine he would not be especially popular with this kind of approach to his audiences. What is fascinating is that the Dybbuk, nevertheless, at least men with self-reported. Hillel is writing about his own experience. We really have no way of knowing what actually happened in that room. But the Dybbuk underlines the expertise of Hillel and talks about how, wow, nobody else could get me to talk except for you, Hillel. You really are a Baal Shem of extraordinary proportions. And even though I'm not leaving this woman, and I have a lot of terrible things to say about the elders of this community, I do have to say a lot of compliments to you, Yasher Koach Hillel, says the Dybbuk. So, a fascinating kind of story. You get the kind of feel for what's going on in this environment. Now, what is not going on is, I'll just show you a couple of slides here. This is the Baal Shem Tov Shul. The Baal Shem Tov, not Hillel. The Baal Shem Tov, at the same time that Hillel is wandering throughout Eastern Europe without much success, the Baal Shem Tov is significantly establishing himself as a legitimate authority. Again, these are essentially the rebels. These are the figures who are challenging the Lithuanian elite. Hillel is not having success, but the Baal Shem Tov is in fact getting an establishment position. Not only does he get this wonderful building in Medjugorje in western Ukraine, we also know from the magnificent research of Moshe Rossman, who, once again, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was able to access a lot of archives that were previously closed, and he found the tax records of the Baal Shem Tov, which is an absolutely amazing thing. He actually found the W-2s of the Baal Shem Tov. This is one document here. You can see there's a whole list of people in town, and here it says Baal Shem. right? Which is referring to the Baal Shem Tov. In Polish, he's referred to as a doctor, which is common for rabbis at the time. And what Moshe Rosman has absolutely definitively shown in his work, In Quest of the Baal Shem Tov, the historical Baal Shem Tov, he was a real person who made a significant, he was a real communal authority. He was, maybe in his youth, he was kind of like a countercultural figure, but he actually made it to the establishment with a respectable salary, with a home in the wealthier part of town, with lots of associates. And by the way, many of the stories that are told about the Baal Shem Tov in the various collections published by his students have characters which Moshe Rosman actually chased down and found them living in the same neighborhood as the Baal Shem Tov. They were actual historical people. So there's a huge contrast between Hillel, who's wandering from place to place, performing these exorcisms and getting kicked out of town, and Baal Shem Tov, who is actually making tremendous, measurable economic success with much of the same message. And we'll have to explore why these differences. Okay. Any questions or observations or arguments to this point? Clear as the sun at noonday, as usual. Okay. So, what is going on with the Urja Kabbalah? We talked a little bit about the fact that it's not so bizarre that Jews have always had a relationship to what, if we were anthropologists, we might call magic. The attempt to change the world through supernatural means is not something foreign to Judaism at all. There are a tremendous number of stories in the Talmud and in earlier midrashic texts that refer to what we would call magic. We also have what some scholars would call shamanism. I mean, the term actually makes me sort of it bothers me a little bit because it sounds a little too sort of witch doctor-y. But you know what? Some of this stuff is kind of witch doctor-y. Some of this stuff is kind of like taka bizarre. So if we understand it, if we step back in the anthropological kind of perspective, we see that Judaism does have in it, or I should say Jewish culture does have a certain place in our societies for these kind of miracle workers. You can even look in contemporary Jewish newspapers about usually women who read oil poured into hot water or even tea leaves and all kinds of things. Look in the back sections of respectable Jewish newspapers and you'll find these references to people who will, for a fee, talk about your soul and your problems and give you some advice and things like that. So without being a halachic authority, because I'm not even a rabbi, there nevertheless is, from a sociological perspective, a very old tradition of having such people within the Jewish worldview. The Lithuanian response to this, as you might suspect, is one of extreme skepticism, which is not necessarily borne out by the literature. The Vilna Gaon, for example, was a renowned Kabbalist. Even though he was at the same time the pinnacle of the Lithuanian system, he nevertheless was very erudite in Kabbalistic literature. And he has quite a bit to say about the efficacy of amulets. And he has a kind of skepticism about any particular amulet maker. But the concept of an amulet is certainly not foreign or strange to him. So this whole enterprise of creating amulets and of, treating mental illnesses as spirit possession, things like that, is something that we see much more in the early Hasidic period. And it's possible that this contributes to the conflict between the Misnagdim and the Hasidim. The Hasidim are devalued and seen as superstitious, as seen as being very credulous, whereas the Lithuanians are very rational and, very well dressed. That's a joke. People usually laugh at that, but I'll probably cut it on the internet because it didn't sound so funny. But this kind of difference in popular culture may have contributed to the conflict between two approaches to Judaism. Okay, let's go on. Now, back to Hillel. What was the book about? By the way, the book is called Sefer HaCheshek. That's what he titled his book. Cheshek means desire, and there are several books actually written with this particular title, Sefer HaCheshek. At one point, he claims that he was not the author, at least of the third-party content that he reports. It actually was a wisdom attributed to Solomon, but at other places he contradicts himself. It's not entirely clear what's going on with the origins of the book. Most likely it's material that he learned from his Kabbalistic teachers. It has, by the way, a tremendous amount of Slavicism in it as well. It's fascinating that when he describes some of the various spells that are to be used to treat various maladies, there's a lot of Ukrainian language built right into it. Not Hebrew, but Ukrainian, which might mean a tremendous borrowing from shamanistic activity in the surrounding culture. But why did he write this strange book to begin with? I mean, if this is an esoteric knowledge, why is he sharing it? And why is he, also including a tremendous amount of autobiographical information? So, Dr. Petrovsky-Stern opines, and I think very convincingly, that essentially this book is Hillel's rather desperate attempt to get a permanent job. That this book is kind of like a CV, a curriculum vitae, in which Hillel demonstrates his bona fides, talks about his past and about his training, and then goes and says, and if you don't, believe me, look at these great amulets that I'm going to write down here just for you. Looking at his peregrinations, Dr. Petrovsky-Stern opines that Hillel was actually seeking a job in Germany. He wanted to get a permanent position like the Baal Shem Tov as a resident Kabbalist. He wanted to be able to minister to the physical and spiritual needs of a community, not in the context of a traditional rabbi, but he was trying to, show that in fact he was quite employable. Look at this amazing exorcism I performed in Ostra, for example, where even the Dybbuk went on and on about how great a Baal Shem I was, and that this is actually a 760-page job application. And it's a fascinating theory. I think it's quite convincing. What's fascinating about it as well, I'm very interested in the transition from manuscript to printed culture. Now remember, we're talking about 1739. Printing has been around for almost 3 centuries now. Jews for sure have been publishing since the late 15th century. And the manuscript is really losing totally to cheap published materials. We're beginning to show a tremendous devaluing of the kind of information that can only be shared, in very small numbers. There's only one copy of this book in the entire world, and it just cannot be replaced. It's a single gem. And he wrote it as a one-time, one-off document that is perhaps self-serving, but nevertheless not intended for large popular consumption. And he decries at great length those cheap imitation Kabbalistic manuals, of which there were about half a dozen that were in circulation at the time, writing essentially the same kind of thing that Hillel was writing about. How to cure, depression with this amulet, or how to get a better parnasa with that amulet. There's quite a few of these circulating at the time, and he goes on and on saying, they're no good, you can't rely on them, you can only rely on my one copy. This is the true manual to how to write amulets. It's obviously a losing battle, because printing would vastly overtake the manuscript culture that he was trying to preserve. And it says, I think, a lot about what's happening in our own time with the popularization of the Internet, the overwhelming popularization of the Internet that has completely changed so many of the ways in which we value information. I have a lot of what I think are really interesting things to say about that. If you're curious, look at my lecture on Jews and the Gutenberg Revolution. I think it's called Who Were the Sonsinos? They were early Jewish printers. And I think there's a lot happening today Jewishly that is fascinating because the internet has changed so much. At any rate, here he is. He's just at the losing side of the entire zeitgeist. He is losing religiously because the world is really not that interested in the shamanistic activities that he's involved in. They're just not willing to give him a permanent job. He's losing because science is actually really making huge inroads among Jews, and Jews are beginning to see science as a much more reliable way to treat illnesses and so on. So he's being edged out by his medical competitors. And of course, he has no real medical training himself. And the very media that he chooses to represent his ideas in a manuscript is definitely behind the times. But let's look at one last point here. Why didn't Hillel, and remember, the Baal Shem Tov is also doing a lot of the same kinds of things. The Baal Shem Tov is also involved with the spirit world and with amulets and things like that. Why is it that the Baal Shem Tov is a revered leader of the Jewish people who created this massive movement? And Hillel, we just heard about since my friend Yochanan discovered this manuscript. So Dr. Petrovsky-Stern says some fascinating things. First of all, he says, maybe we should call Hillel the master of the evil name. Baal Shem Ra, I guess. Why? Because in the 760 pages, he can't say much at all about the value of redemption. He can't say much at all about the love of community, of fellowship, of the positive message that completely permeates everything the Baal Shem Tov talks about how love of fellow Jews is so prominent in the Baal Shem Tov's thought, not relevant at all in Hillel's work. Hillel is all about, this person's sick, this is how you cure it. This person is depressed, this is how you cheer them up. There's none of that redemptive message whatsoever. And whereas the Baal Shem Tov spends a lot of time communing with God and helping people commune with God, Hillel's best reference comes from the Dibuk, comes from the other side, the Sitra Achra, as it were. So Dr. Petrovsky-Stern says maybe we should call him the master of the evil name. But we could not see a sharper contrast between the uplifting and positive message of the Baal Shem Tov, and as a result, the Hasidic movement that was spawned by his ideas, and Hillel, who was not nearly as expansive in his vision, much more narrowly focused on diagnosing the ill and treating them in this manner. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. Please applause so it sounds good on the internet. Thank you very much. Someone actually...
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.